On the day my daughter married that man, I decided to hide the fortune I had inherited from her mother from them. This decision was not born of fear. No, it was purely a matter of survival. I knew all too well the artificial sparkle in the smile of the man who would become my son-in-law, the greed between his teeth. And unfortunately, I was not wrong. It was only a few days after the wedding. They showed up at my door with a lawyer, a black briefcase in their hands, and their ambition hanging in the air, leaving an almost metallic taste. They thought they were coming to take care of a simple signature. They saw an old man in a wheelchair as easy prey, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. My name is Arthur Blackwood. I am 81 years old. My body has betrayed me below the waist since that damn traffic accident 10 years ago. But don't be fooled by this pile of metal and wrinkled legs. My mind is clearer than it ever was in its sharpest days. I live alone in my high-ceilinged apartment in Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood, surrounded by my books and memories. For half a century, I managed companies in the cutthroat corporate world, resolved crises, and buried many men who underestimated me in the graveyard of business. That morning, when the doorbell rang 3 times in an impatient, insistent rhythm, I already knew who my executioners at the door were. I had been waiting for them for a week, ever since my daughter Elena's ostentatious but soulless wedding. I had watched her glide across the dance floor with that man, Julian. Elena's smile was fake. It was a mechanical laugh I couldn't recognize. She was like a puppet moved by invisible strings. Julian, meanwhile, was like a skilled puppeteer holding the strings, drunk with victory. I gently pushed the joystick of my wheelchair. The quiet hum of the electric motor echoed across the parquet floor. I didn't rush. My progress toward the door was slow, not because my motor was slow, but because I wanted them to wait. I knew they were holding their breath on the other side of the door. I wanted them to feel, even before I opened the door, that I was in control of this house, this time, and this life still pulsing through my veins. I pressed the remote control and unlocked the door, which creaked open slowly. All 3 of them were there, lined up like the ugliest figures in a painting. Elena was dressed in black, as if she had come to a funeral rather than a post-wedding visit. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes impossible to hide even with makeup. Julian. Ah, Julian. He stood there, his hands in the pockets of his expensive pants, wearing that classic real estate agent smile that tried to be reassuring, but actually said, "I'm here to sell you out." Beside them stood a skinny man, lost in his cheap gray suit, carrying a worn leather bag. He reeked of cheap cologne and helplessness. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," said Julian. His voice was like a velvet-covered knife, soft but ready to cut. I didn't respond. I slowed the speed on my chair's control panel to 0. I lifted my head slightly, looking at them not from below, but as if into the depths of their souls. My eyes wandered first to Elena, then to the skinny lawyer, and finally to Julian. I let the silence grow heavy in the corridor, intensify and turn into a pressure that made them uncomfortable. Elena couldn't look me in the eye. She fixed her gaze on the patterns on the floor. This avoidance told me everything I needed to know. Guilt is the heaviest burden a child can bear toward their father, and Elena was crushed under its weight. Julian stepped forward, as if wanting to break the tension created by the silence. Without waiting for permission, without being invited, he placed his hand on the doorframe and pushed the door wide open. He barged in as if entering his own property, as if my wheelchair were just a piece of furniture to be overcome. As he passed my wheel, the edge of his coat brushed my arm, Inside, I thought, so this is how we're going to play the game. By violating boundaries, trampling respect. I let all three of them pass. When I pressed the remote to close the door behind them, the mechanical click of the lock startled the skinny lawyer. Julian walked straight to my antique dining table, as if he had memorized the floor plan of this house. Maybe he really had. Maybe Elena, during her sleepless nights, had whispered to him where I kept the valuable documents, if not the safe's code, then at least its location, offering this stranger all the secrets of the house. Julian stood in front of the desk. He ran his fingers over the mahogany, not like a buyer, but like a commander inspecting conquered territory, touching my belongings. That touch carried a claim of ownership. The man in the gray suit cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Leonard Vane, attorney," he said. His voice was that of an actor trying to sound important, but actually just reading memorized lines. He extended his hand. I turned my chair slightly toward him. I shook the hand he offered. His palm was cold, damp, and lifeless. It was like touching a dead fish. He avoided my gaze as I shook his hand. A coward. A lawyer who avoids eye contact either doesn't believe in his case or is guilty. Leonard Vane was probably both. "Make yourself comfortable, Arthur," said Julian, pulling up the carved mahogany chair at the head of my dining table, the one reserved just for me. "I see you're already seated." This was no simple courtesy. It was a sly reference to my wheelchair, to my immobility. He crossed his legs as if he owned the place. I moved my chair across the table by slightly manipulating the joystick and locked the brakes. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the room. "I'm perfectly comfortable," I said, maintaining the icy tone in my voice. "The real question is how comfortable you are sitting at my table without my permission." Julian smiled. That smile. It was the same mask he wore when he shook my hand on the wedding night and said, "I'll take care of your daughter like the apple of my eye." Even then, a voice inside me had said, "This man's eyes look like a hunter's." And now, standing in the middle of my living room, sprawled among my belongings like an emperor, I knew I hadn't been mistaken. Attorney Leonard placed his briefcase on the table as if he had received an invisible signal. The sound of the zipper opening echoed in the silent room like the hiss of a snake. He took out a thick file with a black cover. He placed the file on the table, not directly in front of me, but at a distance that required me to reach for it. Even this small, condescending gesture was calculated. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice taking on a fatherly seriousness, "we need to discuss serious matters. Matters that affect the whole family, especially Elena's future." The word family came out of his mouth like a curse. I turned my eyes to Elena. She was slumped in the single chair by the window. Her hands were clasped in her lap, the diamond ring on her finger glinting in the dull autumn sun. Her shoulders were slumped. "What matters?" I asked, even though I knew the answer as well as I knew my own name. Julian lifted his chin toward the file. "Look." I struggled to pull my chair up to the table and reached for the file. When I lifted the cover, my anger rose through my veins like hot mercury. I turned the pages, deeds, Swiss bank account statements, details of that special fund left by my mother, the existence of which only I knew about. It was all there. Copies of documents that should have been in the safe in the most secret corner of my house were now in front of me. Without lifting my head, without letting my voice tremble, I spoke. "Where did you get these?" The room held its breath for a moment. Then Leonard replied, as if reciting a memorized script, "These are public records, Mr. Blackwood. Our access is legal." "You're lying," I said, fixing my eyes on Leonard's evasive gaze. There's no record of this fund's existence. These documents came from this house. Someone violated my privacy. I turned my gaze to Elena. She still wasn't looking at me, chewing her lip. In that moment, I felt the cold blade of betrayal in my back. I had given her the key. I had shown her the safe. "What do you want?" I asked, unable to tolerate any more of this charade. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "We want to help you, Arthur. Accept it. You're not young anymore. And this..." He waved his hand toward my wheelchair. "This situation is limiting you. Managing all this property, these complex investments, is exhausting for someone in your condition. You could make mistakes. You might start forgetting things. We want to take this burden off your shoulders." I let out a short, dry, joyless laugh. Mistakes? Forgetfulness? My legs don't work, Julian, not my brain. I've been managing this fortune for 60 years. I never lost a penny, even on Wall Street's bloodiest days. And now you're telling me I'm senile just because I can't walk? Leonard interjected, with that nauseating expression he'd learned in law school's Pseudo-Compassion 101 course. "Mr. Blackwood, please don't get defensive. Old age and disability, these are legally sensitive situations. Admitting you need support is not a weakness." "I have nothing to be ashamed of," I said, squeezing out each word like a bullet. "But you too should be ashamed of trying to make a father look helpless in front of his daughter." Just then, I heard familiar tapping on the gym floorboards, the sound of a cane, and immediately after, the rhythmic sound of hard-soled shoes. Mrs. Eleanor and retired Colonel Douglas, my neighbors, my friends, the people I entrusted with my key in case of emergency. The door was ajar, and they must have heard the rising voices. They appeared at the doorway. Eleanor had a tray of cookies in her hand as usual, but her face was grim. Douglas stood stiffly, maintaining his military posture like a sentry. Julian turned uneasily. "This is a private family meeting," he said sharply. Eleanor didn't move. She fixed her eyes on Julian. "Arthur is our friend," she said, without a tremor in her voice. "And if there are shouts coming from inside when his door is open, it's no longer a private matter." I didn't say anything, but I didn't want them to leave either. With my eyes, I told them to stay. Julian clenched his jaw. Leonard nervously adjusted his tie. Perfect, I thought. I have witnesses. Let these vultures' masks slip. I forced my eyes away from Julian's hate-filled gaze and turned them to my daughter, Elena. I gently turned my wheelchair toward her. The whine of the motor was like a silent scream between us. "Elena," I said, trying to soften my voice, "do you really see what these men are doing? This isn't help, it's an execution." Finally, she lifted her head. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes red and swollen. In that moment, I saw not a grown woman before me, but that little girl who had skinned her knee falling off her bike years ago. But this time the wound was invisible, and I couldn't heal her. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking, "this is for the best. Please don't make it difficult. Believe me, it's for everyone's good. For everyone's good." Those 3 words hurt me more than the accident that broke my legs, because it meant they were reducing me to the status of a helpless creature that needed protecting, disregarding my will and my dignity. Julian placed his hand on Elena's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of compassion. It was like an owner stamping his mark on his property, possessive and oppressive. "Elena is aware of the situation and agrees with me, Arthur. It's a simple transfer. Quick, painless, and clean. Painless? I snarled. You plan to rip out my soul and you say it will be painless? They didn't answer. Shortly after, tense from not getting what they wanted, but confident they would return, they left. Julian in front, Leonard behind, Elena at the very back, head bowed, like a ghost following their shadows, exited the house. When the door closed, the silence of the house fell upon me. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was that stifling stillness before the storm. Mrs. Eleanor and Colonel Douglas approached me. Eleanor touched my shoulder with her trembling hand. Arthur, what are they after? I fixed my eyes on the empty space they had left at the table. Everything, Eleanor. They're after everything. And in that moment, I felt something stir in my veins that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was an old friend. Adrenaline. The sound of war drums. They thought I was a worn-out, spent old man, cast aside. But there was one thing they forgot. A wounded wolf is the most dangerous of the pack. The next morning, the second front of the war opened. I was in the kitchen. In my specially adapted kitchen, where the countertops had been lowered to accommodate my wheelchair, I was making my coffee. As I slowly pushed down the piston of the French press, I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal in the door lock. The door hadn't been knocked on. That sound of the key turning in the lock was a declaration that the privacy of my home had been violated. That emergency key I had given Elena years ago was now in the hands of my enemy. My hands trembled, but I didn't spill the coffee. I quickly rolled my wheelchair into the living room. All three of them were there. Julian had already sprawled out on my favorite chair. Leonard had laid his papers out on the table. Elena, with her back to me, was watching the autumn leaves outside from the windowsill. "Good morning," I said, not hiding the venom in my voice. Julian smiled with that infuriating ease of his. "Good morning, Arthur. The early bird catches the worm, right?" I placed my coffee cup on my lap, wrapping my hands around it, as if to warm them. "I don't remember inviting you. In fact, I remember kicking you out." "We're family," Julian said, shrugging. "No invitation is needed among family." Then he opened the file and began reading with the exaggeration of a theater actor, enunciating each word as if there were a child struggling to understand in front of him. "It clearly states here," he said, tracing the lines with his finger, "that Arthur Blackwood transfers his property on Beacon Hill and its appurtenances to his daughter, Elena Blackwood, with full authority." He paused and looked at me. There was that glimmer of fake compassion in his eyes. "Do you understand what this means, Arthur?" "I understand perfectly," I said. "What I don't understand is what difference that piece of paper makes without my signature." Julian's smile froze, but Leonard immediately stepped in. He pulled out a small, black-covered notebook. He sharpened the tip of his pencil. "Mr. Blackwood," Leonard said, raising his voice to an irritatingly loud level. He was shouting as if the paralysis in my legs had also struck my ears. "I'm just asking as a routine check. Do you know what day it is today?" I stared at him without blinking. It was a trap. They would note my slightest hesitation as cognitive decline. "Wednesday, October 24th, 10:14 a.m., I said, without even bothering to look at the clock on the wall. Leonard frowned but continued writing. "So, how old are you?" 81. I'll be 82 in January. That is, if you don't kill me out of frustration before then." Leonard didn't stop. "Do you remember what you had for dinner last night?" I gave a short, sarcastic laugh. "Baked sea bass with asparagus and a glass of Chardonnay." I could even tell you the fish was a little overcooked and the wine wasn't cold enough. Would you like the chef's name and date of birth too, Mr. Lawyer? Leonard didn't answer, just took notes quickly. I could guess what he was writing. Patient-aggressive, displaying defensive behavior, obsessed with details. They were creating a profile. They were portraying me as a grumpy old man who couldn't manage his own life, with a failing memory and paranoid tendencies. And worst of all, Elena. Elena was still looking out the window. She couldn't bear to watch her father being interrogated, treated like a criminal or a madman. But she wasn't doing anything to stop it either. Help me? The anger in my voice was beyond control. I was gripping the armrests of my chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. You're helping me by declaring me a prisoner in my own home, a fool lost in his own mind, by tearing apart the empire I built with my fingernails over 60 years? Elena lifted her head. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving black streaks. But she spoke not to defend me, but to justify herself. No, father, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're wrong. This isn't stealing. This is protecting what is ours. Ours. The word hung in the air. There was no mine anymore. It was as if I had already died, turned into a gravestone, and my inheritance was now ownerless. I was just a breathing obstacle between them and those bank accounts, confined to a wheelchair. My accounts are always in order, I said, regaining control of my voice. Every penny is accounted for. Never a mistake. Julian cut me off. He raised his hand, like a teacher telling a naughty child, Enough! Even that insolent gesture was enough to make my blood boil. Arthur, please, don't exhaust yourself any further. We have evidence. Irregularities, duplicate payments, unnecessary and paranoid phone calls to the bank. I clenched my teeth. What duplicate payments? What are you talking about? Julian pulled a piece of paper out of the file, as if plucking it with tweezers. August electricity bill. It appears to have been paid twice in the system. 2 separate transactions on the same day. This is a classic sign of short-term memory loss. Forgetting you paid and paying again. I had to force myself not to roll my eyes. That memory lapse you're talking about was a glitch in the bank's mobile app. The system froze on the first transaction and didn't approve it. So I tried again. Both transactions went through, but I called the bank the next day and canceled one. The money was refunded. If you check the records, you'll see the refund, if it suits you. Julian didn't even pause. He didn't care about the truth. He was fishing in murky waters. What about your medical appointments? You missed your neurology appointment with Dr. Evans last Tuesday. You didn't go, Arthur. You're neglecting your own health. I canceled that appointment, I yelled, because the elevator was broken that day. When that damn elevator in this building breaks down, I'm stuck in this apartment, Julian. You know that. I called Dr. Evans's office, explained the situation, and rescheduled for 2 weeks later. That's not neglect. It's a logistical necessity imposed by a physical disability. Leonard slammed his notebook shut like a coffin lid. Mr. Blackwood, he said in that obnoxious lawyer voice. Look, we're getting bogged down in details. The real issue here is this. We want to spare you a grueling and humiliating legal process. If you voluntarily sign this power of attorney, everything stays in this room. Private, confidential, and honorable retirement. I grabbed the joystick on my chair and turned slightly toward him. What if I don't sign? Leonard leaned forward and looked me straight in the eye. This wasn't a bluff. It was a direct threat. Then we'll go to court. And believe me, Arthur, this will be public. Your neighbors, your former business partners, your friends at the club. Everyone will read the reports claiming you're senile, that you wet yourself, that you don't recognize your own daughter. We'll make you a laughingstock. And in the end, the result will be the same. You'll just lose your dignity. The room closed in on me. The walls were shrinking. The oxygen was fading. There were 4 of us, but I felt like a wounded animal surrounded. For a moment I looked at Elena. I remembered when she was 10. She fell off her bike and broke her arm. I had waited by her bedside all night at the hospital. "Don't be afraid, sweetheart," I had said. "I'm here." Now she was here, but I was alone. She was letting them tear me apart. She averted her eyes, silently complicit, approving of them. Just then, there was a knock at the door, but it wasn't a gentle tap. 3 strong, determined knocks, and without waiting for a response, the door handle turned. Mrs. Eleanor entered. She held a silver tray with a porcelain coffee set and her homemade cinnamon cookies. She instantly cut through the room's toxic, tense atmosphere with the scent of freshly baked cookies. "Good morning," she said, in a surprisingly cheerful voice, as if there were no funeral atmosphere inside. "I brought Arthur his morning coffee. I heard his nurse didn't come yesterday, so I thought he shouldn't be without coffee." Julian jumped up like a spring. The controlled mask on his face cracked for the first time. "Ma'am, this is highly inappropriate. We are in the middle of a private family meeting. Please leave." Eleanor pretended not to hear him. She placed the tray on the table Julian was occupying, right on top of Leonard's threatening files. Accidentally, but firmly. The porcelain cups clattered. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, turning to Leonard. "Did you have papers? I hope they're not stained." Julian's jaw clenched. Leonard frantically gathered the papers, like a squirrel trying to save its precious documents. Eleanor slowly turned to me. She put her hand on my shoulder. That touch carried 1,000 words. "You're not alone. I'm here. I see you." "Are you okay, Arthur?" she asked, looking deep into my eyes. I nodded slightly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm fine, Eleanor. You came just in time. Thank you." Eleanor scanned the room with her eyes. First she looked at Elena, that shadow of shame. Then at Leonard, and finally, long and hard, at Julian. There was no innocence in her gaze, no purity of an old woman. Instead, there was the sharpness of an eagle. She weighed Julian, measured him, and found him wanting. "If you need anything," he said to me, choosing his words carefully, "the Colonel and I are in the next room. The walls are thin, Arthur. We can hear everything. Any call for help, too." And just as he had come, he left with his head held high. But he didn't close the door completely. He left it slightly ajar. That crack in the door was my lifeline. I was no longer alone. I had a witness, an ally. Julian's face turned bright red as he watched Eleanor walk away. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt that this battle wasn't over yet. On the contrary, it had only just begun. I smiled inwardly. Get angry, Julian, I thought. Anger makes mistakes, and you will make mistakes. The door Mrs. Eleanor had accidentally left open, and the smell of cookies had thrown Julian's pressure cooker of a mind into disarray. Julian glanced at his watch, trying to hide his anger. "Let's take a lunch break," he said, his voice tense. "Arthur needs to rest, too." As if he were the one who was tired. While Leonard gathered his bags, Julian grabbed Elena by the arm and dragged her outside. I didn't close the door behind them. I stepped into the hallway with the soft hum of my motor. The cool air of the apartment building hit my face. I thought I'd find them waiting by the elevator, but Julian and Leonard were already gone. Only Elena remained. She was sitting on the steps of the fire escape at the end of the hallway, her head buried in her knees. Her shoulders were shaking. I approached her in my wheelchair. She flinched at the squeak of my tires and lifted her head. Her makeup was smudged, her face a wreck. "Elena," I said. There was no anger in my voice, only exhaustion. "We need to talk. Without lawyers, without your husband. Just you and me." She looked away, focusing on the fire extinguisher on the wall. "I can't, Dad. Julian, he'll be back soon. He just went to get coffee." "You don't need Julian's permission," I said. "You're my daughter, not his property." Those words triggered her. She turned her head sharply toward me. In her eyes was a pain I'd never seen before, a pain that had been there for years. "It's better to be your property," she said, her voice sharp as a knife. I froze. "What do you mean?" Elena took a deep, shaky breath. She stood up, climbed one step higher to look down at me. "Dad, you never really gave me anything in my life." "Yes. You paid for my school, bought my car, took care of my bills. But every time you made me feel how much of a favor it was. I remember the look on your face when you signed a check, that 'again' expression. I never felt love, only obligation. I raised you all by myself," I defended myself, my voice echoing down the hallway. "You were 7 when your mother died. I ran the company while also combing your hair and attending parent-teacher conferences. I never neglected anything." "You neglected my feelings!" he shouted. His voice cracked. "Even when you hugged me, you were tense, as if you were at a business meeting. Julian showed me this, that you controlled me so, that you used your love like a reward system. You only loved me when I was successful, strong, flawless, just as you wanted me to be. When I was weak, when I made mistakes, you wouldn't look me in the face." I felt myself shrink in my wheelchair. Because maybe he was right. I was so preoccupied with my own pain, my own battles in the business world, that I forgot she was just a little girl who wanted a father. Julian found that void and poured his poison into it. "Julian loves me for who I am," Elena said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "With my flaws, my fears, like you never did." Before I could reply, the elevator doors opened. Julian appeared holding cardboard coffee cups. He stopped when he saw us, plastering that fake smile on his face, but his eyes were threatening. "Ah, family bliss? Elena, sweetie, you should come. Our guest will be here shortly." He extended his hand to Elena. Elena looked at me for a moment, then took his hand, like clinging to a lifeline. And in that moment, I realized I was about to lose my daughter. He was stealing not just my money, but her heart too. An hour later, the doorbell rang again. But this time they weren't alone. Julian entered first, followed by Leonard. And behind them, a man in his 50s wearing glasses without frames and dressed like a razor. Instead of a black leather briefcase, the man carried a medical document case. His gaze was cold, analytical, and distant. He looked at me not as a human being, but as an insect to be examined. "Mr. Blackwood," said Julian, with the air of a victorious commander, "we wanted to introduce you to someone. An expert who will help us resolve this situation in the most professional manner. Dr. Jeffrey Thorne." The man bowed his head slightly. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. I am a psychiatrist." I frowned. I didn't call for a psychiatrist. I don't have a mental health issue. I have a physical disability. Wrong field of expertise, doctor. Dr. Thorne sat down in the chair in front of my desk without asking permission. He placed his bag on his lap. You didn't call, but your family did, and the court approved it. Leonard took an officially sealed document from his jacket's inside pocket and placed it in front of me. Emergency court order, he said. Due to your daughter and son-in-law's statements, your tense relationships with neighbors, and your recent financial inconsistencies, the judge ruled that a psychiatric evaluation should be conducted. I looked at the paper. The seal was real. The signatures were real. They were going to interrogate me in my own home, in my own chair. Dr. Thorne took out his pen. Mr. Blackwood, he said, in that professional but condescending tone of voice, I'm going to ask you some standard questions. Please cooperate. Resisting will only prove the seriousness of your situation. Julian stood behind me, arms crossed, smirking. He had set the trap. If I didn't answer, they would say I was uncooperative, unconscious. If I answered and made the slightest mistake, they would say I was senile. I fixed my eyes on Dr. Thorne. Ask away, doctor, I said. But remember, I've spent my whole life analyzing people. While you're evaluating me, I'll be evaluating you. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat and began his questions. His voice was sterile and emotionless, cold as a scalpel. Mr. Blackwood, let's start with some simple orientation questions. What year is it now? I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. 2024. Election year. Uncertainty reigns in the markets, especially in tech stocks. Thorne took notes. And where are we right now? Boston, Beacon Hill. In my apartment overlooking Louisburg Square, built in 1850, where we are now, surrounded by 3 vultures. Leonard shifted uneasily. Thorne remained impassive. Let's do a backward memory test. What did you have for breakfast 3 days ago? I smiled. Oatmeal, blueberries, and almond milk. Earl Grey tea on the side. Also, that morning's Financial Times headline was about turbulence in Asian markets. Would you like me to recite the article verbatim, Doctor? Thorne hesitated. His pen hovered over the paper. This wasn't what he expected. He was expecting an old man who mixed up his words and forgot his days. Instead, he was faced with a mind that reported like a company CEO. Julian's patience was wearing thin. He began pacing back and forth in the room. Enough of this nonsense, he suddenly roared. His voice was so loud that Elena jumped. Doctor, write the report. It's clear the man is paranoid, seeing things. He calls us vultures. He's detached from reality. Thorne hesitated. Mr. Julian, my current observations show no significant cognitive impairment. On the contrary, the subject's awareness is quite high. Julian's face turned bright red. He walked over to the table and slammed his hands hard on the wood. I'm paying you, Thorne. You're here to do your job, not to admire him. The room fell silent. Julian had lost control. Elena looked at her husband in horror. Julian, she whispered, what are you saying? Julian turned to her, his eyes wild. Shut up, Elena. We're going to lose everything because of your father's stubbornness. He grabbed Elena's arm, digging his fingers into her flesh. Elena cried out in pain. At that moment, the last shred of mercy inside me vanished. Take your hands off my daughter, I said. My voice was low, but so firm that Julian stopped. Or what will you do, old man? Julian said, looking down at me. Will you run me over with your wheelchair? I reached for the touch panel on the right armrest of my chair. No, I said. I'll hit you with the truth. I pressed the panel. The lights in the room dimmed automatically. The massive 8K television screen above the fireplace lit up. This house wasn't just accessible. It was a state-of-the-art, smart fortress. Since I couldn't move, I had set up a system that allowed me to see and hear everything remotely. Julian's mistake was thinking it was just a TV remote. A clear, high-resolution video appeared on the screen. The date and timestamp was in the lower right corner. 3 weeks ago. Julian was in the video. He was in the middle of this living room. Leonard was next to him. I was in the hospital at the time for routine checkups. Julian in the video said, "We need to find the code." Leonard replied, "Atata. The old man's safe is in the bedroom, but there's an alarm system." Julian laughed. "I disabled the alarm with the key I got from Elena. We just need to open the safe and find those damn Swiss bank books. Once we get the signature, it'll all be ours." Everyone in the room froze. Julian stared at the screen. The blood drained from his face. I pressed another button. The image changed. Julian was talking to Mr. Henderson, our building superintendent, at the front door. He pulled a thick envelope from his pocket and slipped it into the man's pocket. "Don't tell anyone about Mr. Arthur's visitors, especially if his daughter comes. Tell her her father is asleep and send her away." Dr. Thorne had already started gathering his things. His hands were shaking. I can't continue under these conditions," he stammered. "Sit down, doctor," I roared. "The best part of the show is coming." I projected one last document onto the screen. It wasn't a video. It was a digital bank statement. A large transfer from Julian's front company to Leonard Vane's personal account. There was a coded reference in the description, but Leonard knew exactly what it meant. I rolled my chair toward Julian. That imposing, arrogant man was now reduced to a cowering rat, shoulders slumped, cornered. "Burglary," I said, listing each crime on my fingers. "Invasion of privacy, bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud. And now," I turned my eyes to Thorne, "attempted forgery." Thorne jumped to his feet. "I had nothing to do with this! They tricked me!" He rushed toward the door. Leonard followed him, fleeing without even gathering his papers. Only we remained. Me, my devastated daughter, and my son-in-law, his mask now fallen. Julian stared at the screen, at the digital evidence of his own crime. Then he turned to me. The hatred in his eyes was mixed with fear, but it was still there. "How did you do this?" he whispered. "You looked at my legs, Julian," I said. "You focused on my inability to walk, my wheelchair, my age. But there was one thing you forgot. A hunter sets the best trap without moving. This house is my castle, and you are an amateur thief trying to climb the castle walls without permission." Elena began to sob. "Julian, you told me my father was sick. You said we had to protect him." Julian didn't answer. He just stared at me. And in that stare I saw an abyss far deeper, far darker than money or greed. This man was defeated, but he hadn't given up yet. The room was filled not with the emptiness left by those who had gone, but with the tension created by those who remained. Julian could no longer look at the images on the screen. His gaze was lost on the floor, on the patterns of the carpet, but his shoulders were still tense, like an animal preparing for one last attack. I rolled my wheelchair a little closer to him. The sound of the motor was no longer a threat, but a harbinger of inevitable end. I opened the leather-bound folder in my lap. This folder was not the report prepared by that foolish Leonard who was after Julian, but the one I held, prepared by Boston's best private detective. I took a digital printout of an old, yellowed photograph. I slid the photo onto the table in front of Julian. "Who is Naomi Rivers, Julian?" Julian's head snapped up like a puppet. His eyes locked onto the photograph. In that moment, the arrogant, invincible mask on his face shattered. What I saw was no longer a con artist, but a wounded child. A pure, distilled pain flickered in his pupils. That name. His voice was barely a whisper. "Where do you know that name from?" "I'm Arthur Blackwood," I said, without a shred of mercy in my voice. "Did you think that while you were researching me, I wouldn't be researching you? I found that photo in an orphanage record, St. Jude Children's Home, 1970. Julian reached for the photo but didn't touch it. His hand hung in the air, trembling. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice cracking. "Who I am doesn't change the fact of what you are." "What am I, Julian?" I asked. "A rich, spoiled old man in a wheelchair? One of those elites you hate just because they were lucky enough to be born that way?" Julian suddenly laughed. But it wasn't a cheerful laugh. It was a sound filled with shards of glass, tearing at his throat. "Lucky? You're not lucky, Arthur. You're chosen. You're one of the few whose life is handed to you on a silver platter. People like me, though, we have to fight for crumbs. You take the elevator to the place we clawed our way to with our fingernails." "People like me," I repeated. "This class hatred is so stale, Julian. You've been married to my daughter for 6 months. You're not here to eat my fortune. You're here to destroy me." I saw that look in your eyes. "This isn't about money. This is personal." Elena rose from the corner sofa. Her face was white. "Julian, what is he talking about? Who is Naomi?" Julian didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on me. There was no fear in that look now, just a deep, bottomless darkness. "It's all about you, Arthur. Everything has to do with your perfect family, your noble surname." "Speak plainly!" I roared. Julian leaned on the table, bringing his face close to mine. His breath hit my face. "Your mother, that saint, Victoria Blackwood. Have you ever asked yourself what she did 60 years ago?" My blood ran cold. My mother, whom I knew to be authoritarian, strict, but honest. "My mother died 10 years ago," I said sharply. "How convenient," Julian said with venomous sarcasm. "She left without having to answer for it. But the wreckage she left behind is still here." "What did my mother do?" I asked, unable to hide the hesitation in my voice. Julian straightened up, adjusting his jacket. It was as if the broken man from moments before had vanished, replaced by a cold avenger. "She ruined lives. That's what she did. She threatened a woman, a pregnant woman. She sent her into exile and caused the unborn child to grow up without a father." Elena put her hand over her mouth. "Julian, what are you saying?" Julian walked towards the door. He put his hand on the doorknob, but before opening it, he gave me one last look over his shoulder. "That child was me, Arthur, and Naomi Rivers. She was my mother. Your mother ruined her life, and you just carried on living like a prince in that mansion as if nothing had happened." "That's impossible," I whispered. "My mother wouldn't do such a thing." "Investigate, Arthur," Julian said. "Tell that detective you trust so much to look at Victoria Blackwood's bank records from 1964. Find the hush money payments. And when you learn the truth, then come and ask me for an explanation." He opened the door and walked out without looking back. The sound of the door closing echoed in the room like a verdict. Elena collapsed where she stood. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Could this be true?" I couldn't answer. Because somewhere inside I remembered my mother's harsh temperament, her rigid stance that would do anything for family honor. And for the first time, I was afraid. Not of Julian, but of the past. After Julian left, the house felt like a bombed-out shelter. There was no physical damage. The antique vases were still in place. The paintings hung straight. But the emotional devastation was so palpable you could feel it in the dust particles in the air. Elena was crouched on the rug at my feet, crying silently. I was frozen in my wheelchair. My mind kept drifting back to 1964, to those lost times. My mother, Victoria Blackwood. Authoritarian. Ice Queen Victoria. What would she risk to protect the family's reputation? Could she send a grandchild to an orphanage and mother into exile? The possibility that the answer was yes squeezed my heart. "Dad," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Is this possible? Julian, could he be my brother?" I turned my chair toward the window. Boston's lights flickered below. "I don't know, Elena. I really don't know. I was young, irresponsible. But if I had a child, if I had known, God, if I had known, I would never have..." I took out my phone. I called Detective Marcus Hayes. "Marcus," I said, my voice tired but determined. "Find me everything. My mother's bank statements from 1964 to 1976, her personal expenses, her lawyer meetings, everything, especially any records related to Naomi Rivers or St. Jude Children's Home." Marcus didn't ask any questions. He was the embodiment of professionalism. "Give me 48 hours, Arthur," he said, and hung up. Those 48 hours felt like 48 years. Elena didn't go home. She couldn't bear to breathe the same air as Julian in that apartment. She stayed in the guest room. We wandered around the house like two ghosts. I rummaged through old albums in my study, searching for a trace of guilt on my mother's face. Elena spent hours in the kitchen, staring into space. Marcus arrived on the evening of the second day. He had a thick, brown envelope in his hand. His face was grim. It wasn't the face of a man bringing good news. We sat down at the desk in my study. Marcus opened the envelope and laid the documents that came out on the table, one by one, on the carved wood. "Arthur," Marcus said, keeping his voice low, "this is hard to say, but Julian was right." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My breath caught. Marcus pushed a bank statement toward me. Date? May 12th, 1964. Recipient: Naomi Rivers. Amount: $50,000. A fortune at the time. The description field was blank. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said. He pulled out another document. Monthly donations to St. Jude Children's Home. Regular, uninterrupted payments. On the 15th of every month. Sender: the Victoria Blackwood Foundation. "Your mother," Marcus said, looking me in the eye. "She paid for Julian's orphanage expenses for 12 years. His clothes, private lessons, medical bills. It all came out of this account. But the records list her as anonymous donor." Elena brought her hand to her mouth, sobbing. "Why?" she asked. "Why didn't he bring him home? Why did he hide him?" Marcus took a deep breath and pulled out the last document, the most crucial one, an agreement with the Lozano family, an adoption protocol. Date: July 1976. "Because he was a problem," Marcus said harshly. "When Julian turned 12, when puberty started, and he began to look like you, your mother probably thought the risk increased. She wanted him gone. The Lozano family was wealthy, but had no children. Your mother hopped each of them, Julian. On top of that, she made a substantial investment in their company in return for these favors. I looked at the document. My mother's signature was there. That sharp, confident signature. She had handed over a child's life, my son's life, to others like a business deal. I have a son, I whispered. My voice sounded like it wasn't mine. And he grew up thinking I abandoned him all these years. Hating me. I covered my face with my hands. I shrank in my wheelchair. Julian's anger, that pure hatred, now made sense. He wasn't just a hunter chasing an inheritance. He was a wounded child, deprived of his father's love, bought and sold. And I, because of my own mother's sins, had become my son's enemy. Naomi, I said suddenly, lifting my head. Where is Naomi, Marcus? Is she alive? Marcus nodded. Yes. She lives in Birmingham, Alabama. She goes by the name Carol Solis. She has a small, modest life. I have to find him, I said. I started the motor on my chair and headed for the door with purpose. I need to talk to him. He's the only one who can tell Julian the truth. The only one who can expose my mother's lies. Elena stood up. I'm coming too, Dad. I won't leave you alone. This could be dangerous, Elena. Julian is my brother, Dad, she shouted. The man I thought was my husband is my brother. Every part of this story concerns me. I'm coming. I saw the determination in her eyes. She was no longer that timid, cowed girl. She was a woman in pursuit of the truth. Get ready, I sound to son. We're going to Alabama, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. We were ready to leave before the first light of dawn touched the Boston skyline. But when you live in a wheelchair, saying let's go isn't that simple. I had to check the lift system on my specially equipped minibus, grab my spare batteries, and organize my medications. These logistical necessities slowed down the urgency of our escape. Elena went downstairs with a small suitcase to the covered parking lot. I followed her in the elevator. The cold, damp air of the parking lot stung my lungs. When I reached my minibus, I saw Elena frozen beside the driver's seat. A shadow emerged from the darkness. Julian. The sharply dressed, confident man was gone. His shirt was untucked, his tie loose, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness and madness. He had no weapon in his hand, but his stance was as dangerous as a bomb ready to explode. You can't go, Arthur, he said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the parking garage. I can't let you find that woman. I pushed my wheelchair between Elena and him, like a shield. Get out of our way, Julian. The game is over. We found your mother. Julian laughed hysterically. My mother? That woman isn't my mother. She sold me. And now if you go and talk to her, you'll destroy the whole life I've built, the only truth I believe in. He took a step toward me. I won't let you. What are you going to do? I asked, trying to stay calm. Are you going to beat me up? Punch your father in his wheelchair? Julian stopped. He reached into his pocket. For a moment I thought he was pulling out a gun, and my heart skipped a beat. But what he pulled out was a state-of-the-art smartphone. He turned the screen toward me and held it up to my eyes. What I saw made me sick. They were photos of Elena. But Elena in places she'd never been, wearing clothes she'd never wear, and some without clothes. Deepfake, Julian said, grinning triumphantly. Artificial intelligence is amazing, isn't it, Arthur? While you were equipping your house with smart systems, I learned to use technology in a different way. These are so realistic that even experts have trouble telling them apart. Elena screamed and covered her face. You're sick! Julian pulled the phone back. If you get in that car and go to Alabama, Arthur, these photos will end up on the internet. I'll destroy Elena's reputation, her career, her social circle, everything. Her life will be ruined until people learn the truth. My fingers were numb from gripping the armrests of my wheelchair. Standing before me was not just a con man, but a man who had completely lost his soul. I was cornered. I could fight for my own honor, but I couldn't gamble with my daughter's honor. What do you want? I growled. I don't want you to leave, Julian said. You won't look for that woman. You'll close the investigation, and you'll give me my share of the inheritance. In return, Elena's reputation will remain clean. I closed my eyes. I felt like a king on a chessboard. But then I felt Elena's hand on my shoulder. She was trembling, but her grip was firm. Let's go, Dad, Elena said. Her voice was ice cold. I opened my eyes and looked at her. Elena. The photos. I don't care, Elena said, looking Julian straight in the eye. Publish them, Julian. Do whatever you want. Let me be disgraced. Let people talk about me, I don't care. But I won't let you scare me again. I won't let you threaten my father. Those photos are fake, but your evil is real, and everyone will see it. Julian recoiled in shock. He hadn't expected this reaction. He had expected his victim to beg. Elena moved to the driver's seat. I activated the lift platform and climbed into the minibus. As the door closed, Julian was still standing there, clutching his phone tightly. Don't do it, he shouted after us. I will. I swear I will. Elena stepped on the gas. As we left the parking lot and merged into the daylight, I saw that Elena's hands gripping the steering wheel were white as a sheet. She was crying silently, but she didn't stop. It was a long journey. Those endless highways stretching from Boston to Alabama flowed by like the thoughts in my mind. When night fell, I couldn't sleep. Sitting in my wheelchair in the specially modified back of the minivan, I thought about the past. My mother, Julian, Elena, how one lie had poisoned 3 generations. I didn't know if Julian had published those photos. We had turned off our phones. We had cut ourselves off from the world. We were focused only on the truth. The next afternoon, we arrived in the suburbs of Birmingham. The address Marcus gave us led to a small wooden house hidden among the trees, far from the city's noise. The garden was neglected, but the potted flowers on the porch showed that someone hopeful still lived here. We parked the minibus. My wheelchair slowly descended to the ground. Elena moved behind me and began pushing my chair along the gravel path. My wheels turned with difficulty over the stones. Every meter was a difficult step into the past. We reached the door. I rang the bell. Slow footsteps could be heard from inside. The door creaked open. The woman standing before us had Julian's eyes, the same dark, deep gaze. But the hatred in Julian had been replaced here by years of weariness and sorrow. Her hair was pure white, her face mapped with wrinkles. When she saw me, her eyes widened. Then her gaze shifted to my wheelchair. For a moment, she didn't recognize me. But then she looked into my blue eyes, and time stood still. "Arthur?" she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question, but a ghostly confirmation. "Oh my God. Arthur." "Hello, Naomi," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "It's been a long time." She pressed her hand to her chest. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "One day, somehow, I knew that boy's curse would bring us together." She opened the door wide. "Please, come in. I have nowhere left to run." As I crossed the threshold, I knew that the final piece of the puzzle that would change Julian's or Damon's life, my life, and Elena's life was waiting for us inside this little house. In Naomi's small living room, time seemed frozen in 1964. As Naomi served us coffee with trembling hands, 60 years of confession poured from her lips. She told us how my mother, Victoria, had threatened her, how she had accepted a bribe to protect Julian, whose name was Damon back then. But that wasn't the most painful part. "Before I left," Naomi said, tears filling the deep lines on her cheeks, "I lied to Julian. I told him you knew about us, but that you rejected him. To cover up my own cowardice and helplessness, I made you out to be a monster, Arthur. Don't hate him. He's a child I poisoned." Elena covered her mouth with her hand. "So all this hatred, it was all based on a lie?" I turned off the motor of my wheelchair. Only our breathing could be heard in the silence of the room. "We'll take him to Boston," I said. "Julian needs to hear this from you, Naomi. You need to look him in the eyes and tell him." The return trip was silent, but this time the silence wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of the approaching storm. It was midnight when we arrived in Boston. I called Julian. "Come to my house," I said. "We'll talk about the inheritance." He fell for the tone of surrender in my voice. He came, thinking he had won. When he entered the living room, the confident, arrogant Julian was back. But when he saw the old woman sitting next to my wheelchair, Naomi, I will never forget the look on Julian's face at that moment. His face collapsed like a building. "Mom?" His voice came out like a broken piece of glass. Naomi stood up. "Hello, my son." Julian recoiled, his back hitting the door. You're dead! You sold me out!" "I didn't sell you out," Naomi said, taking a step toward him. "I tried to save you, but I poisoned you. It wasn't Arthur's fault, Julian. He didn't know about us. I made up that lie." Julian shook his head from side to side, on the verge of a fit of madness. "Lies! You're all liars! This man bought you, didn't he?" I pushed my chair toward him. I threw the file in my lap. My mother's damned bank statements, the adoption contract, onto the table. "Look!" I roared. "Not your mother. My mother planned everything. Victoria Blackwood sold her own granddaughter like a piece of property. You and I, Julian, we are both victims of the same woman." Julian looked at the papers. His hands trembled as he read. And then, that angry man knelt down on the carpet. His shoulders shook as he began to cry. It was not the cry of a monster, but of a child who had lost his mother. I went to him. Reaching out from my wheelchair, I placed my hand on his shoulder. For the first time, he didn't flinch. For the first time, there was no hatred in that contact. What are we now?" Julian asked, lifting his head to look at me. There was a 60-year-old emptiness in his eyes. "We are a wreck," I said honestly. "But something can be built from wreckage." Elena came over to us. She couldn't look at Julian, but her voice was firm. "We are siblings, Julian. This marriage, this everything, it's over. Tomorrow the lawyers will begin proceedings to annul the marriage." Julian nodded. I know, Elena. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry to my sister. I'm sorry." The following months were like the recovery process after surgery. Painful, slow, but necessary. I divided the inheritance. Half went to Elena, and the other half was divided between Julian and Naomi. Julian refused at first. "I don't deserve it," he said. "This isn't about deserving it," I told him. "This is the price for the life my mother stole. Take it and build yourself an honest life." Julian took the money but didn't stay in Boston. He moved south with Naomi to a quiet town. He and his mother are trying to make up for those lost years. Me? I'm still sitting at this mahogany table. My legs still won't hold me. My wheelchair is still my faithful steed. But I'm not so alone anymore. Now Elena comes in the evenings. Sometimes we just sit and are silent. Sometimes Julian calls. Our conversations are brief, distant. But every time he says, "Dad," I hear the ice in his voice melt a little more. My name is Arthur Blackwood. I am 81 years old. I spent most of my life dealing with contracts and stocks. But I made my biggest investment, took my biggest risk in the autumn of my life. Forgiveness. Was it easy? Never. When I look at Julian's face, do I still see that blackmailer? Sometimes. But then I remember that orphanage photo, and the anger inside me gives way to compassion. If this story taught you anything, support me and subscribe to my channel. My name is Arthur, and finally, I am truly home.